A lot of the reporting about the food crisis makes it seem like a perfect storm, which is an unfortunate analogy because it makes it seem like there are a whole range of acts of God that have conspired to make all this happen. But these aren't acts of God. These are definitely human-made. And let's look at the reasons why the price of food has gone through the roof at the moment. You've got the price of oil being today $135 a barrel, soon $200 a barrel is what people are projecting. Now, on top of that, that in itself feeds through to the food system because a lot of the way we grow our food is contingent on pesticides and fertilizers. And one of the key ingredients in fertilizers is natural gas. So when the price of oil goes up, the price of natural gas goes up, and the price of fertilizer goes up, the price of food goes up. Now, that's a political choice that we've made to move towards this chemical and agrochemical intensive kind of agriculture. And that's certainly one of the elements here. Another reason is biofuels, or more properly agrofuels, the idea that you would grow food not in order to be able to eat it, but to set it on fire. And that's what agrofuels is at the end of the day. It's burning food. And that's a mad policy when the price of food is so high. And it does contribute, even the president suggests it contributes 15% to the cost of food. On top of that, we've had bad harvests, possibly because of climate change. And again, climate change is something we made. We did that. And that's something we can do something about. On top of that, we've got a shift in the tastes towards meat and dairy, which are very fossil fuel and energy and food intensive, and they drive up the price of food too. And again, we can choose to move away from that as well. And finally, financial speculation. This is also driving up the price of food, and these are all things that are absolutely sort of anthropogenic. There's no God here, acting in weird and unpredictable ways. These are all things that we are responsible for and that we can change. So that's certainly the sort of short-term story of the food price rises. And in the long term, the chronic sort of underdevelopment of most of the world by a few rich countries and a few rich elites has also contributed to this. The World Bank's regime of structural adjustment policies have all conspired to destroy developing country agriculture and substitute it with this, either as an industrial export agricultural model or to hook developing countries in many ways on US food imports. And that's why you're seeing riots in the streets, because people are demanding not only food, but they're demanding that their governments pay attention not to the international market, but to them. There's enough food around to feed the world. But so I mean, in a sense, it's not strictly a supply problem. The problem is one of distribution. But at the moment, there isn't enough world, and there isn't enough planet to be able to sustain the level of consumption we have in the United States, for example. Too much meat is eaten here, too much dairy. It would take several planets for everyone on Earth to eat as much as the US does in terms of grain. We just don't have world enough. So certainly unsustainable consumption here is part of the problem. But it is possible to redistribute food and to ensure a right to food, or rather, to ensure that the right to food that already exists is respected. But that requires political will and a certain amount of involvement in shifting away from this market-based mechanism for distributing food towards something that looks a little more socially and economically just. There's a very conscious decision, and there's been one for a while, that small-scale sustainable agriculture is to be consigned to the dustbin of history. That peasants are an anachronism and do not belong in the modern food economy. And a lot of policy has been very explicitly geared towards kicking them off their land. The most egregious examples are to be found in Colombia, for example, where the violence and the paramilitaries are very clearly targeting small farmers, driving them off the land. And then there's a government policy that says that if the land has been vacant for 2 years, then a large landowner can buy it. And that's what you're seeing in Colombia. But actually, this de facto process of driving peasants off the land or driving small sustainable farmers off the land, has been going on for a very long time. It's been happening here in the United States too. The US Department of Agriculture is seriously tilted towards large-scale industrial farming. and also tilted against minority farmers. I mean, until recently, one of the biggest legal cases in U.S. history was the case of black farmers against the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who had systematically discriminated against them. And so it shouldn't come as any surprise that small-scale farmers in California should be discriminated against too. But this is part of a bigger picture. I mean, part of a broader set of issues and a way of structuring agriculture and agricultural technology that the U.S. government has been particularly involved with. Now, one of the examples that kind of illustrates this is with genetically modified crops. It's very interesting to me to see the origins of how GM crops were fed to American people, because most American people, if they're asked, would rather not eat genetically modified crops, but they were never given the choice. And they're never given the choice because of some legislation that Dan Quayle, one of your more hapless vice presidents, some legislation that he passed in his mercifully short tenure as vice president. He started an initiative to cut red tape. And the idea was that red tape was an impediment to the innovation of American industry. And so when it came to things like FDA approval, he instituted a process whereby Monsanto, for example, wouldn't have to subject itself to the FDA doing all the tests. And to make sure that it was in compliance with safety standards. The FDA would be willing to accept a letter that said, we, Monsanto, have done all the tests, and to the best of our knowledge, it complies with FDA regulation. And the FDA would be prepared to accept that instead of doing independent science. Now that's very worrying, because if you're concerned about sustainable agriculture, and if you're concerned about, if you believe that the government is actually looking out for the best interests of consumers and the health of its people, you're sadly mistaken. It is looking out for the interests of the corporations that sponsor it. To my mind, there's a very clear connection between that weird moment of deregulation that allowed the proliferation of genetically modified crops without any independent science. And the kinds of strange policies that are tilted towards agrochemicals and agro-industry today, particularly around the light brown apple moth spraying. What's interesting is that the current way that we farm is very new and very unusual. I mean, for millennia, farmers worked on ways to be able to increase soil fertility and to reduce sort of the influence of pests through intercropping, through using different kinds of farming techniques so that you attract beneficial insects by planting one kind of crop, and you increase soil fertility by planting another kind of crop. Farming happened without any of the inputs that we use today. But it was a political decision, really taken in the 1960s, that the majority of the world should use these highly fossil fuel intensive agricultural chemicals. And the companies that supplied them were very happy to have US government backing to sell fertilizers in developing countries. And fertilizers and pesticides together, and they do go together. They go together in this modern industrial agricultural farming system, because what modern industrial agriculture does is do away with the millennia of knowledge that we've learned about intercropping, and instead it destroys ecosystems, because monocultures, organic or not, monocultures are about selectively just growing one thing, and then having to replace all the ecosystemic functions that you've lost by growing a monoculture and substituting for those using chemicals. So you have to increase soil fertility now using inorganic fertilizers. You have to fight pests, not because you're not relying on the natural predators, but by using pesticides. So the addiction to these kinds of chemicals is part of the symptom of, part of the picture of modern agriculture, and the people who supply these chemicals are the people who, at the end of the day, are the winners. Companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow. These companies are rebranding themselves to some extent as life science companies, which I think is a painful distortion of the truth. They're not really in the science of life so much as death. They are pesticide companies. They're about killing pests, and they're also in the business of privatizing life. I mean, these companies are not just the fertilizer and pesticide manufacturers, they are also now the world's largest seed companies. And that control over the sort of basic tenets of the food system is another symptom of this concentration of power that happens under modern industrial agriculture. Now, any attempt to try and crack that open, well, they don't look too kindly on it. They fought tooth and nail, for example, to prevent people from knowing about the presence or absence of genetically modified crops in the US. But they've also fought tooth and nail to prevent an adequate knowledge or adequate study of the effects of their pesticides and their fertilizers. So the pheromone, for example, that is going to be part of the light brown apple moth spraying, is allegedly one of the best kinds of pesticide, though of course we're always told that the next generation of pesticide is one of the best new innovations, and it always turns out that they have unwanted and sometimes desperately horrible consequences for humans and for the ecosystem. But that's just one of the ingredients that forms part of the broader package of spraying. And while there is one active ingredient, there are a dozen inactive ingredients that don't have to be declared, and where we are being denied knowledge. And this idea of keeping consumers and citizens in the dark is something that's integral to this modern industrial farming system. An important question is, how are we going to feed the world? By 2050, there will be 9 billion people on this earth. So how are we going to make sure that there's food enough for everyone? Well, a panel that was chaired by the same guy who did the climate change panel, the International Panel for Climate Change. Well, there was a version of that for food, and it recently released a report. The panel was called the IAA-STD, the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development. A bit of a mouthful, but if you go to agassessment.org, you can find the details. Now, what this was a kind of brain trust of 400 scientists from dozens of countries who were asking the question, how are we going to feed the world? And the conclusions they came up with were quite surprising, because even though Monsanto and the big industries were part of this panel, the science was kind of tilted against them, because the findings were that industrial agriculture probably won't, in fact almost certainly won't be able to feed the world, and that genetically modified agriculture may have a part at best in the future feeding of the world, but actually not really, because the way, with oil prices being as high as they are, with inorganic fertilizers being increasingly unaffordable, we need other ways of building soil fertility. And that means agroecological science. This doesn't mean going back to some misty-eyed, bucolic past. It's not about we should all go back to the Dark Ages, because the Dark Ages were rubbish, and no one wants to go back to that kind of situation. No one wants to go back to a situation where people had their product taken away by landlords, where women didn't have rights, where most people didn't have rights. We want to go forward, but we wanted to draw on the lessons of the past and bring to bear some of the most cutting-edge science possible. Now, one of the ways of doing that is through agroecological science, to build soil fertility using ecology, using nature, using the life's own infrastructure, to selectively bring out of the soil the best kinds of things, and to put into the soil the possibility of sustaining life in the future. Now, this is the very antithesis of modern agriculture and modern industrial agriculture, because actually there are very few inputs, if any, into this kind of agroecological farming. Very few opportunities for profit for the pesticides industry or for large corporations, and yet, as a result of this IAA-STD report, that was kind of the way that they were suggesting that we feed our world of 9 billion people, that we do need to shift towards sustainable agricultural technology, and that pesticide and fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer driven agriculture is definitely part of the problem in the long term. The current food crisis is kind of an opportunity for these corporations, and although, as I say, the best kinds of alternatives are agroecological ones, you'll find in crowing from the rooftops proponents of genetically modified technology and industrial agriculture saying that theirs is the technology that is going to feed the world. And they're going about it not just sort of aggressively by pushing governments to adopt their technologies, and engaging in all kinds of diplomatic shenanigans to be able to make that technology work. There was a long lobbying effort, for example, from the US government on the Vatican to be able to get the Catholic Church to sanctify GM crops. But on top of that, you're seeing slightly more subtle and more pernicious kinds of intervention. For example, in the Gates Foundation is promoting a new green revolution for Africa. Now, of course, the old green revolution in India has already left farmers struggling, and in the epicenter of the old green revolution, there's soaring rates of farmer suicide, and soil fertility is absolutely through the ground, and there's very little soil fertility, there's very little groundwater. So the old green revolution, not so good. But the new green revolution is being pushed nonetheless. And if you look at who's behind it, it's very interesting. One of the senior vice presidents from Monsanto now works at the Gates Foundation, a man called Robert Horsch. And he has been, together with a lot of the brainiacs, or so-called brainiacs at the Gates Foundation, have been responsible for actually pushing a particular technological line, not because it is the best science, not because it is in the interest particularly of the people in Africa, but because it sustains a particular proprietary vision of how the world should be fed. And that, sadly, is detrimental to pretty much everyone involved except the Gates Foundation and Monsanto. This industrial food system doesn't happen by accident. It requires powerful actors to shove this food and this food system down our throats. And that means that it happens often in very undemocratic ways. Developing countries, for example, were forced to liberalize their economies and their agriculture, not because they thought it was a good idea, but because they had to, because they were told to do so by the World Bank. And governments were put into the position of either defaulting on their loans and going bankrupt, or accepting the World Bank loan but accepting its conditions. And if it accepted the conditions, it had to impose the policies that were very unpopular with its people. In other words, modern development policies have a built-in anti-democratic bias. Because a technological solution is a way of removing democracy from the public sphere. Now that has engendered a range of protests. I mean, farmers' movements around the world have for a very long time been protesting the effects of the globalization of corporate agriculture, and the knock-on effects that they've seen in terms of their ways of life being exterminated. The World Trade Organization protests in the United States were an example of that. But 7 years before the World Trade Organization, the Karnataka State Farmers Association was already on the case, was busy translating the World Trade Organization draft text into an Indian language, into Kannada. And they were discussing it in the fields. 20 million farmers absolutely engaging in democracy and demanding to know what their government was doing and how the government was selling them out, and taking up arms against those governments. They were really taking to the streets. I mean, it was a non-violent protest, but nonetheless democratic outrage at what the government was doing. Now, that's one example of the ways that this kind of agriculture is anti-democratic. But you can see it right here in the United States, with the spraying, for example, is happening despite every reasonable person within California being outraged about it, and yet it still carries on. And I think that that's a sign that we have yet to sufficiently hold our politicians' feet to the fire. Because the only way that this industrial agricultural juggernaut will be stopped is through popular pressure and outrage and action. And I think direct action is very appropriate right now as a way of combating this anti-democratic and potentially very, very dangerous sort of intervention in all our lives, not just in the food system, but for anyone with kids, anyone who's pregnant, anyone who's worried at all about their health or the health of the people around them, should be very angry and should definitely be holding their politicians to account in a very vocal and very direct way. One of the hopeful elements right here is that there are these sort of islands of sanity in an insane system, that there are farms and communities and spaces, even cities, that are moving towards sustainable agriculture. Agriculture that is pesticide-free, that is inorganic fertilizer-free, that is about sharing seeds rather than proprietary seeds, that is about breeding and experimentation and intercropping. And those systems are... they can be found in cities, for example. One doesn't have to go very far. San Francisco, for example, during the war, grew 40% of its own food right here. We're as part of the San Francisco Food Policy Council, something we're working on at the moment, we're trying to move back to that. And to be able to use public space, to be able to grow food that is tasty, nutritious, fresh, local, organic, and agroecological, in ways that fit into communities right here. And those little projects and those sort of moments where, for example, urban agriculture is sustained by urban microprocessing, which generates jobs and generates income within within urban areas. That's a way of disconnecting from these huge corporate kinds of agriculture. But you are seeing more and more interest in this kind of agroecological farming technologies and the kinds of social organizing that goes around that. If for no other reason that the price of oil is so high that people can't afford to carry on with the sort of lunatic inorganic fertilizer approach that is careening us into a future of increased climate change and uncertain health outcomes. And so these movements look very democratic, they look very decentralized, they look very local, they look very sort of politically engaged, but they look very, very different indeed, therefore, from the sort of technocratic juggernaut of profit that the current industrial agricultural food system is characterized as. The LBAM spraying movement is a great opportunity, I think, because it could just be a rattle bag of people who just want to agree on one thing, which is that they don't want to be sprayed. And even if that's all it was, that would be fine. But it's a great opportunity to think about building a movement for something much better. And that means not only that organizing around the LBAM spraying should also be organizing for sustainable agriculture, not just against LBAM, but for a different way of doing things. But we do need to recognize where those barriers lie, the barriers towards progressive social change. Now, some of those barriers are at a municipal level, and those are the easiest ones to be able to sort of pick away at. But certainly at the state level, the Agriculture Board at the state level is a bastion of interests for industrial agriculture, and that needs to change. And the only way that it will change is through very aggressive kinds of organizing and mobilizing and sustained mobilizing, not just around LBAM, but for sustainable agriculture. It also means shifting a range of policies from the policies that, for example, in your local municipal council, where does it buy its food from? Where does the school district get its food from? What kind of rules does the school district have about toxins in the food? Well, opening those up to public scrutiny is a great way of starting again to sort of shift towards being able to make more conscious choices about where our food comes from. And again, the FDA guidelines, at a federal level, absolutely need to be sort of kicked up a gear, and we can hope that in the next administration that will happen, because it certainly won't happen in this one. I think that there are a range of barriers from the very local to the international, but ultimately the only way that we'll find out what those barriers are and how to breach them is by doing it. We can pontificate all we like, but the real test of social organizing isn't in a hypothetical, but it's in action.